Firstly, thank you for choosing to come to this session today. I know there's a great range to choose from. The main focus today is a critical reflection on the summer pre-sessional, and I'll assume that most of us are involved in pre-sessionals in one capacity or another. I'm going to offer you today my own critical reflection on the summer course. It is largely my own, so please forgive any self-indulgent tone. But rather than just my own sort of personal ramblings, I'm hoping to cast it through the conceptual framework put forward by Stephen Brookfield, who talks about the 4 lenses of critical reflection. And I'll say more about that as we go on. I'll give away the punchline straight away, tell you what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to be able to give you any shiny solutions or pre-packaged alternatives, or even necessarily suggest that one is necessary or possible. But rather, what I hope is that maybe a space might emerge for some open and frank and honest discussion about some of the issues that can make the summer pre-sessional a pretty difficult place to be at times. We've been called upon to be honest and brave, so I'm genuinely keen to hear from colleagues about shared experiences, any alternative approaches and adjustments. And you'll see maybe from the abstract that I've billed this as part rant today. It seems a shame to rant on a Friday, especially in such lovely surroundings, but I say that, I don't wish to cast too pessimistic a tone, but I say that partly because you may have noticed that the language that we instinctively use to talk about this pre-sessional can sometimes tend towards the ranting side of things, or certainly suggest a kind of worrying reality. So even just a glance at the BALEAP mailing list around about September time, you'll frequently hear reference to colleagues who got through the pre-sessional, who are getting over the pre-sessional. You might remember in September last year that the original call for papers for this very conference was extended by a few weeks to allow colleagues more time to recover from the pre-sessional. One colleague at Glasgow captured it sweetly when they said that on their summer pre-sessional anxiety scale, they were dropping from heart attack down past palpitations to the relative tranquility of minor niggles, which is a great album title, The Relative Tranquility of Minor Niggles. And it's clearly tongue-in-cheek, but there is a serious point to be made here. Why are we instinctively reaching for the language of cardiac arrest and survival to talk about our experiences on our flagship EAP courses? So that's what I'd like to try and get towards today, and there I think Brookfield can be useful. So Brookfield calls upon teachers to hunt the assumptions that underpin what we do, to adopt a stance of permanent inquiry, as Brookfield calls it, to be constantly vigilant of the structures of power and hegemony within which we operate, and essentially to deconstruct what we do and why, which seems to kind of chime with the conference theme. And through this, productively disturbing insights are possible. And there's certainly something disturbing about the language that we're using to talk about our experiences here. And to that end, Brookfield offers 4 vantage points or lenses of critical reflection: students' eyes, colleagues' perceptions, personal experience, and theory and research. And I'll try and draw upon these today, some more so than others, some more anecdotally, some more formally, including some kind of informal surveys that I've been undertaken at Glasgow. I should say that, well, firstly, I'll think about some of the assumptions that I think maybe underpin what we're doing in the summer pre-sessional. Arguably, these are countless, but I've narrowed in on 4 that seem to be the most pressing. And I've chosen to frame them as questions there in the abstract, but essentially they come down to issues around interests, well-being, precarity, and autonomy. And I'll try and expand upon these along the way. It's worth saying that there may be things that are particular to Glasgow. Try to avoid going down the rabbit hole too much, and in the other direction, it can be difficult to kind of disentangle the pre-sessional from where it sits more broadly in higher education, and in fact it might be unwise to try and do that at all. So firstly, to interests. Well, the student interests should really be at the heart of the entire enterprise, shouldn't it? Or at least they ought to be. And at Glasgow, there's good news on that front. We've seen consistently high student satisfaction rates and feedback, and a shared sense among colleagues that students are genuinely supported and guided linguistically and academically, but also in a pastoral sense. And there's something nearing consensus in the literature that students perceive genuine value and reward from times on summer pre-sessional courses, even if that isn't always translated into future outcomes further down the line. And on the teacher front, again, there's good news to be had. Last year we surveyed our teaching team of over 60 teachers at Glasgow. Feedback was often very positive. A supportive and professional working environment, solid course design, a professional approach, all of these things highlighted, which are all to the good. But there is another story here. In recent years, our pre-sessional numbers have grown significantly to a level barely imaginable only a few years ago. And a key concern of mine is that the course size, the student numbers, appears to be the key metric, maybe the only metric by which success is measured. It's the bigger the better. So when we report on our pre-sessionals on other school and college forums, we unconsciously celebrate the biggest ever pre-sessional. And perhaps rightly so, but there may be a dangerous precedent there that simply because a course gets over the line, as we so often put it, that's then evidence of an ability and a stamina and a willingness to keep going again and again, on and on. The autobiographical lens might be useful here. My role has changed somewhat in the last few years to include less pre-sessional teaching, more convening and recruitment. And as I've sort of assumed more organisational responsibilities, call me naive, I'm sure you will. It's been called worse. But I was relatively astonished to learn that there was essentially no mechanism by which student numbers could be controlled or even accurately predicted in a way that wouldn't potentially jeopardise student and staff experience. The only control on numbers is temporal. In other words, student applications will be accepted until virtually the last minute, with no guarantee that you have teachers to teach them, to maintain manageable class sizes and in line with UKVI regulations and so on. So rather than us kind of driving the course forward in a way that's safe and sensible, and to say that this is what we can safely accommodate in order to deliver a high quality programme, consistently feel as though the course is kind of chasing us in the other direction. You can see Indy there, he just about gets over the line each time, and on and on. Now, again, naive, maybe because this isn't particularly surprising, maybe it's not all that different to how admissions work more generally across other parts of the institution. But the strain that this puts on course organisation and those responsible for it is considerable. If I'm able to report sort of informally on behalf of colleagues, we've had numerous conversations where we've wondered if it wouldn't be better for the whole thing to just kind of collapse, for want of a better word, in order to demonstrate to those higher up the institutional hierarchy, if that's the right word, that the model is basically unsustainable and it kind of ignores the well-being of the people who are at the heart of it. So from that same staff survey last year, one comment stood out: you feel like a cog in a wheel rather than a human. It's pretty stark stuff. I mean, it's only one comment, but it's conspicuous in its severity. And although it's not my comment, it's the title of this talk today because it's often, it kind of reflects what I've often felt about time on the pre-sessional course. There's uncertainty built into the machinery of the thing, which is a recipe for guaranteed anxiety, and it's probably a big part of the reason why we're continually talking about recovering from the pre-sessional. Next to precarity. This is my only day at the conference, unfortunately, but I gather that precarity has been sort of high on the agenda across the 3 days. As I mentioned before, my role's changed more recently to involve more pre-sessional recruitment, as I'm sure is the case kind of centre-wide or across other centres. Our programme is staffed primarily, almost exclusively, by fixed-term teachers. And again, what we say is revealing. Another term might be precariously employed or insecurely contracted. And I say that as someone who spent many years on 0 hours posts and receiving an annual termination of contract letter and all the esteem issues that come with that. And I have a note here to mention the very recent kind of result, if you can call it that, of industrial negotiations and a pledge from employers to look at contract types and this phrase of specifically defined reasons for offering fixed term or indefinite employment. I just wonder, where does the pre-sessional sit in there with such a vast annual turnover of fixed term staff? It's maybe something we can come back to in a discussion later. Each year we rely heavily on returning colleagues, about 80% last year, and then a smaller group of teachers who are joining us for the first time. And again, from an organisational perspective, that summer pre-sessional anxiety scale, remember, from heart attack down to palpitations and niggles, that comes from the annual uncertainty of whether you'll be able to balance unpredictable student numbers with teachers. But I'm all too aware that from another perspective, the anxiety comes from the annual uncertainty as to whether you'll end up with a job at all. And if so, how much notice you'll be given in order to put in place all of the other things that you have to think about. And then this year, as you'll all be probably aware by now, student numbers have plummeted. Looks like we're heading for a pre-sessional that's less than half the size of previous years. And reasons for that have been kind of discussed even just this morning from the couple of sessions that I've been at. A range of different reasons or factors that may be contributing to that. But what I do know is that at the moment my inbox is filled with messages from teachers genuinely anxious and worried to know if they can expect to be employed with us this year. And that sort of creates, again, anxiety on all sides. There's implicit pressures, perhaps understandable from HR, to make sure that employment practices and recruitment practices are prudent. But again, it's a recipe for ongoing anxiety. And maybe, again, not all that surprising, you have a context of kind of globalised and commercialised education that's pinned to the global fluctuations in consumer demand and student demand. Then maybe it's not all that surprising, maybe it's an unfortunate inevitability. But I think Fulcher's warning is important there, that once any course, but particularly EAP, becomes a commercially successful, it then becomes a commercial activity and it's therefore vulnerable. Or the question that Alex and Ian have posed about how can we uphold the ideals, the values of EAP if it's essentially a commercial activity. If it's essentially a profit-making exercise, then why should we expect loyalty from any stakeholders, institutions, students or staff? You'll probably have guessed by now, issues of well-being are to the fore here. And again, not necessarily unique to EAP or the summer pre-sessional. But there is another pandemic at play, the pressure vessels, the anxiety machines of higher education. In this particular study from institutions open enough to submit data, there's a 70% increase in referrals to counselling, 60% to occupational health. Unsurprisingly, those on insecure contracts are worst affected, around 50% reporting poor mental health as a result. And this is likely to be a serious underestimate of the scale of the issue. It doesn't quite yet fully account for the impact of COVID. For those that are fortunate enough to be employed in the same place year round, the pre-sessional probably represents the fourth term of your academic year. And if you're spread across pre-sessional and in-sessional context, then periods of opportunities for periods of proper rest can feel very stretched. One colleague summarised it by saying that the workload and mental load increases due to switching between courses and because I'm tired, and that there's another 6.5 weeks to go until I get a break. And the kind of no breaks, high stakes nature of the thing over 10, 12, 14 weeks, overlap with the school calendar, can mean that opportunities for breaks with the family, with children, can again feel stretched. Another colleague said it was a fairly constant battle to stay afloat, regular 60 to 70 hour weeks, lost weekends and sleep, real impacts on home life and well-being. Again, it's serious stuff. It seems to chime with the very recent findings again of the UCU's workload survey. It shows that staff in HE are regularly working more than 2 unpaid days per week. And I would argue that the summer pre-sessional can be a hotbed of unpaid labour. It's kind of almost built into the machinery of the thing. It is a pressure vessel within an anxiety machine in some ways. And I have no problem admitting that between about now, April and September, my anxiety levels are significant. It is something that keeps me up at night. And that's as someone who doesn't face a termination of contract letter at the end of everything. The final thing I wanted to mention was around kind of autonomy and professional development. And there's long been calls for greater agency, greater activism in higher education in response to a kind of rampant performance management culture that sees standard and surveillance as the kind of the go-to or the default. As I'm sure is the case in all centres, we try and put opportunities for professional development at the centre of the core of our provision. Our syllabus, our inductions are closely aligned to the TEEP competency framework, for example. We try and foster a supportive, genuinely supportive and collaborative environment, and feedback happily shows that we're successful in that. But there can appear to be a sort of potential conflict between quality assurance on the one hand and professional development perhaps on the other, although it's not as binary as that, but particularly when scale and time is so stretched. We encourage teachers to exercise professional judgment in the best interests of their teachers, but when the syllabus is so tight and assessment stakes are so high and the scale is so large and the need for parity across the programme is so essential, it can feel like the opportunity for sort of genuine manoeuvre can be limited. We've tried to make adjustments over a number of years, welcome adjustments I think, more teaching free days for marking, trying reduction in sort of paperwork and form filling, extended inductions, and yet there are still sort of lingering concerns around unrealistic marking expectations, too much admin paperwork. So again, it speaks to kind of constriction and pressure in the system. There is happier news. We do know, formally and sort of anecdotally, that a desire to pursue professional development through the TEEP framework, for example, is a key draw for colleagues to the summer pre-sessional, to ours and I'm sure to others as well. At Glasgow, my colleague Cara McDermott's her work on perceptions of observations of teaching has shown, I think it's fair to say, a kind of range of perspectives on that, ranging somewhere from intrusion and vulnerability through to empowerment and genuine development. But there are sort of logistical issues again with scale when trying to observe such a large team of teachers over such a short and condensed period of time. It can tend to feel more like a chore than a genuine opportunity for development. But there are welcome sort of developments, evolutions, reduction in paperwork, simplification of rubrics, more opportunities or a range of options rather for the format of observations. So perhaps kind of some happier news to end on. So coming towards conclusions, as I mentioned at the start, I don't wish to appear too pessimistic, but I think the reality is that the summer pre-sessional is a pretty difficult place to be at times, and the language that we instinctively reach for kind of demonstrates that. It may be that this is just an inevitability. As I said, it's maybe not unlike other parts of the sector. It's a space filled with dilemmas and trade-offs where teachers just do the best that they can under the circumstances. And getting a kind of sense of the tone of the conversation, even just from this morning, there could be an argument that summer pre-sessionals days might be numbered, or at least in the form that they currently exist. I think that the reality, I'm increasingly of the view that there's a reality that the institutional interests and the kind of structural imperatives built into the system are often incompatible with well-being, which is a serious problem. Hopefully I've perhaps convinced you that critical reflection from various vantage points can offer a way to step back, to see the trees that make up the woods, to recover in a different way perhaps. Thank you very much for listening. As I said at the start, I'm genuinely keen to hear from colleagues about their experiences. I'll try my best to answer any questions that you might have, or at least deflect them in a way that's convincing.